Welcome to Political Therapy. I am your host, Nicholas Villa. Political Therapy is an online radio program focused on explaining politics and healing society. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Hi, and welcome back to Political Therapy. It's great to be here once again. It's great to do this podcast in English once again. I'm aware that this podcast hasn't been done in English for some time. That changes today. And basically the change is due to the fact that a friend of mine, philosopher Tomás Molina, Colombian philosopher Tomás Molina, was able to get an interview with a world-renowned academic, intellectual, who focuses on the subjects of Hegelian philosophy, Marx, Freudian psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis in general. So he's very much along the lines of this podcast. His name is Todd McGowan. And he was kind enough, and we were fortunate enough to have an interview with him. So that's today's episode. So just before we get into that interview, I want to say hi to our new subscribers and our new listeners, which we're getting on a daily basis. So that's very encouraging for me. So I want to thank you guys. I want to say hi. And without any further ado, here is Todd McGowan. Enjoy.
My first question is about our current situation. One of the most common conservative arguments against emancipatory political movements is Foucaultist. We are already at the end of history. Therefore, every single human is recognized as a human being by the big other, at least in the US. It sort of goes like this. You want to be treated as a human being, but you're already treated as a human being. If it not were for neo-Marxist propaganda, you would be able to see it, right? So oppression is imaginary. Right. Not in the sense of Lacan, in the everyday sense of the word.
Right.
Go home, stop protesting, and enjoy your recognition. That's basically what right-wing commentators say to feminists and black people, etc. So one can argue that today the master supports his mastery by appealing to egalitarianism. But isn't that contradictory? According to common sense, those kind of contradictions should nullify an ideology. But what can Hegel and psychoanalysis tell us about ideological contradiction in this case? Is it possible that contradiction cements the master's rule?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, I think that the what you're talking about, the way that recognition is bandied about as an idea that there's no need for emancipation because you already have recognition. I think that's to me that's that focus. What the idea of that is itself problematic because recognition, I don't think, can ever equal emancipation because recognition always depends on some people being recognized and other people not being recognized.
Yeah.
So the idea of universal recognition is, I think, impossible. And so I think if the ruling system uses recognition as the basis for its what it wants to call emancipation or freedom or liberty or equality, then it's always going to be given to some and not to others. So in that sense, you're right that the way in which contradiction functions can actually be used by the ruling system to sustain its rule, because it gives you it plays lip service to the idea of recognition, but recognition depends on this some in, some out. And if that's not working, then recognition's worth. Like if everybody gets recognized as something, as human, as citizens, whatever, it's worthless if everybody is recognized. So the power of recognition, I think, this is, I think, Hegel's great point. It's maybe clearest in the master-slave dialectic part, right? That there's no such thing as mutual recognition in which everybody gets recognized equally. That just doesn't exist, because the very basis of recognition is the inequality implicit in it.
Yes, but the dominant narrative in right-wing circles is that we've achieved an universal recognition, and that's why they think that current efforts to emancipate an oppressed group can only be, ironically, ideological in the sense of Marx. I mean, a set of ideas which distort our perception of reality.
Right.
And they think that those supposedly neo-Marxist ideologies, which in a way tell people that they're oppressed when they're not, are in a way the expression of a certain bad faith, because they wanna destroy Western civilization, and they wanna destroy our way of life and our prosperity, and therefore we shouldn't take them seriously. But of course, from a Lacanian perspective, that projection onto the other of what we think the other is precisely a projection. I mean, what can we say from a Lacanian perspective of that, of what the right-wing commentators project onto the left other?
Well, I mean, I would say they're the ones that are destroying the civilization, not the left. First of all, but I think that what's interesting is the way this Lacan's idea that the big other doesn't exist, I think, is a crucial idea for how we address this notion that everybody has been recognized. Because if the big other doesn't exist, then it's impossible. The idea of full recognition is impossible, because the big other would be the vehicle of that recognition. So I feel like once you're already talking about, everybody is recognized, everybody's recognized. Once you're on that turf, you're already on a right-wing turf. So I think the question of recognition is always the wrong question to pose, precisely on Lacanian grounds, because the big other doesn't exist, and there's no force that provides the recognition. There's just nothing exists that could be the foundation for the recognition that the right wing is claiming already exists. So my point would be, but that cannot exist, because there's no force that could be the guarantor of that recognition.
But what do you mean when you say that the big other doesn't exist? Because I mean, it doesn't exist in the sense of being how to put it, it's a fiction, right? It's a human creation. And in that sense, it's imaginary in the common sense of the term.
Right.
But what we imagine is real in the sense of existing. I mean, exists in our imagination, and imaginary forces, again, in the common sense of the word, have consequences in the real world. I mean, the fact that it doesn't exist apart from what we imagine doesn't mean that it's not important, or that it doesn't have effects in real life.
Yeah, of course. That's right. The big other doesn't exist, but it does have effects. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Good morning. Sorry. Good morning.
Okay. I'm glad you're here. No, I think that's absolutely right, Tomas. That the big other doesn't exist but has effects. Yes, but it can't be the source of recognition because it's not substantial. It's not a consistent, substantial force. Instead, it's at odds with itself. So the part of it that's giving recognition, another part of it is undermining recognition. You see, so there's no way in which the big other can, even though it does have effects, like it causes people to desire in a certain way, it causes them to try to conform to it in a certain way, right? Of course, but it cannot be the source of recognition. And that's what I think that's what I take from this idea that the big other doesn't exist. That feeling you get when you feel like you're recognized, that really is coming from yourself and not from this external force of the big other, because it can't do that. Like it's too much at odds with itself to be able to grant you recognition.
But aren't human beings like that as well? I mean, we are at odds with ourselves, and we undermine ourselves. So, so how is it possible if the big other is at odds with itself and we are at odds with ourselves?
Right. I think that's why that recognition is impossible. Like that's what my claim to this right-wing narrative of history, that we've all gained recognition. I just think that's a totally impossible position to be in. I don't think it's possible for you to recognize me or me to recognize you, or for the society to recognize everyone. I just don't think those things are possible. That's why I think recognition, I know it's a very popular way of thinking among liberals and right wing. I know liberals, especially in the US, actually liberals that study Hegel, very interested in the idea of recognition. But I think that's a dead end to go down. I really do. Politically, I don't think it's because I don't think it's possible to get, as I said, to grant or receive recognition. I also don't understand what's gained by it, frankly. Like I don't understand. Like if you feel recognized, what have you gained by that? I don't feel like there's any gain. Like I don't think that can be the basis for freedom or for equality or for all these things that we value. I just don't think recognition can be the vehicle for that.
But isn't that Hegel's point, that precisely by recognition you feel yourself like a human being? And what do you think?
No, I don't think so. No. I think Hegel is all about, I think this is the point in the famous master-slave dialectic, right? That recognition fails, that it fails. It doesn't, like the slave in a way triumphs not because the slave gets recognized, but the slave recognizes that recognition is worthless. And so that's like the move out of the master-slave dialectic is right into Stoicism, which is precisely this, like the external recognition is meaningless to me. So I think that from Hegel's perspective, recognition is never an answer. It is true in the encyclopedia, he talks a little bit about mutual recognition as the basis from which society can then develop. But it's very, like, for him, mutual recognition is it doesn't accomplish very much politically. It just means that we are able to have this conversation because there's a mutual recognition. That's all it gives us. There's nothing more than that, because all it is a recognition that there's another subject who's also in the same situation as me. But for Hegel, you can't base anything on that except that we could have this conversation.
All right, but what's the way out? Because if we cannot recognize other people, at least not, we cannot have universal recognition. We can have that. You could argue that what we can have and we have had is the master and slave relation. And we are condemned to that. So what do you think?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think that Hegel's point is that we can, master and slave dialectic is very early in the phenomenology, right? So there are there's a path out of that, he thinks. And I think the path out of it is, it's not through recognition, it's rather through solidarity in our non-recognition or our non-belonging. Like, I think that's really Hegel's position, is that solidarity is only possible through this experience of the failure of belonging or the failure of recognition. So it's actually the opposite almost of the way in which the right has characterized it. Like, it's coming together in our failure to belong. That's really the nature of emancipation, not making everyone belong. I think it's the difference between universal inclusion and the acceptance of our necessary exclusion. Like, I think that's how I would distinguish. Actually, that's how I would distinguish right and left. Frankly, like that. I think the right is all about let's get everyone included, and I think the leftist position is let's embrace everyone in this mutual exclusion, in this failure of recognition. So I think that's how we come together in solidarity, not as all of us sort of put in, but all of us recognize that we're out.
Right. And how is that possible?
Well, I mean, I think it's happening right now in the U.S., right? Like, these protests that we're seeing are not like we want to all come in, but like all the protesters are like, hands up, don't shoot, right? Or take a knee. Like, they're all identifying with those who are out. They're not saying like, I want to become a cop too. They're saying like, we're all in the position of George Floyd, right? Like, that's the guy who was killed. So
yeah.
I think it's a perfect example of that, actually, that there's this mass identification with outside, not with we want to come in.
If I might say something there, this resonates what you've just said, Todd, with the hello and the good morning. This resonates a lot with contradiction, which is something I've seen recurring in your conferences. And you just mentioned the difference between right and left, and here, at least in this part of the world, we have neighboring Colombia and Venezuela, which is of course a real example of galvanized politics, polarization, as it's mentioned here,
right,
or described. And unless you're a centrist, centrists consider Colombia and Venezuela to be the same thing, basically. This whole Chavez phenomenon,
right,
and the Colombian right wing as landholders, paramilitaries, and so on and so on. I, of course, don't think this is the case. However, again, focusing on contradiction, former London Mayor Ken Livingstone, in a very pragmatist way, advised Chavez that he should just kill more oligarchs, right? To embrace the contradiction. Here in this part, in Colombia, in this country, we've just entered recently a peace accord, where basically the basic deal is to not kill each other, right?
Right.
And the right is very much intent on continuing to kill each other. Every day you have a human rights activist or more that is killed, and the left, sort of maintains this, this commitment to peace, basically to not killing each other. I know peace is more complex than that.
Yeah.
So, the question of otherness, the question of Badiou that says politics is always having an enemy, this question of the Jungian shadow, that we project what we banish about ourselves into others. What's the Hegelian take on this contradiction?
Yeah, that's really good. That's a great question. So Hegel's point, I think it's interesting. So the other figure that you didn't mention that I think fits in line with this is Carl Schmitt. The notion of the friend-enemy, for Schmitt, politics is based on the friend-enemy distinction. And when that distinction collapses, we lose politics. So he thinks there's almost an ethical imperative to sustain the friend-enemy distinction. And I think when I wrote that book on Hegel, it came to me that really Hegel's great enemy is Schmitt. That I think that for Hegel, the notion of contradiction, like Schmitt believes that contradiction has to be this external opposition, that's how it has to manifest itself. And that's what you're talking about with the right wing in Colombia right now. But for Hegel, and this sounds a little bit like what the left is doing, where for Hegel, the contradiction is internal and the external opposition is only a manifestation of the internal contradiction. So that you have to read, it's like a process of interpretation. You interpret the external opposition that you experience as an expression of this internal contradiction within yourself, which I think doesn't mean that sometimes you don't have to fight external enemies, right? Like you certainly do. But
that
I
would
think
be the question. Yeah. So what do you? So yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes that happens, but I think you always have to be interpreting the external opposition in terms of your internal contradiction. So I think there's a lot of times when you don't have to fight the external enemy because you realize this is just a manifestation of an internal contradiction for me. And so you have to then attack yourself. And I think, to me, the great Hegelian film is Fight Club, right? Like Fight Club is all about the attack on the self as a way to then enable political action. So it's a real, I think that linking this attack on the self to this internal attack on the self to external political action is a real, I think that's crucial thing for the left. And that's why I find Fight Club is a kind of like a tutorial for leftist politics.
Awesome. Yeah. And that's a very even psychoanalytic standpoint, because I'm linked to therapy, and their stance is basically that when you hate something about somebody else, it's your projection of your own banished desires and even your own banished shadow, so to speak, and therefore there's no point in this aggressivity or aggressiveness, because it's just a part of you that you've banished to the shadows.
Except I would just add, Nicholas, I would add that there is a good reason to be aggressive toward yourself. Right? Like,
okay.
I think, like, if you don't, I kind of think that this is another way I would distinguish left and right, that left, the target of its violence is internal, and the target of right-wing violence is always an external enemy.
Awesome.
Yeah. To sustain their own identity.
Yes, exactly right. When you're attacking the opponent, it's you sustain your own identity. That's exactly right.
I remember that in Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, he says that he portrays the master as a being without contradictions, like sort of without resentment, pure and noble. And I think that Nietzsche's narrative is a good way of because the way Nietzsche shows it is the way that the master has always interpreted himself.
Right. That's
so he doesn't understand that he has internal contradictions.
Right.
And Nietzsche believes the master. He thinks that the master indeed doesn't have internal contradictions, that he doesn't have resentment, for example, which is something that it's, for me at least, quite difficult to believe, because I every day I see that the masters are full of resentment towards the slaves. Right. They, for example, the resentment that the masters have towards communism is quite unbelievable. They hate it with all their being. It's not like Nietzsche says that if they avenge whatever the other has done to them, they're okay, and that's it. No, the master is full of resentment as well.
Right. No, it's a great point. I think that this is one of the points on which Nietzsche and Hegel are totally at odds with each other, because Hegel's a kind of recognition. He's the first philosopher in history, I think, to recognize the slave as the site of truth and not the master. And it's interesting that for him, Susan Buck-Morss has a great book on this called Hegel and Haiti, and I think it's because of his attention to the Haitian Revolution that he came to this position. So it's interesting. I think it's like he learned from Haiti this lesson, that the truth is on the side of the slave. And I think you're exactly, I think resentment is a perfect word, but I also think envy, right? Like, isn't the master full of envy for the slave? And the slave's freedom, in fact, which is interesting, right? Because slavery is defined as loss of, you don't have freedom. But I think the master envies the slave's freedom to enjoy. And I think that's really, and to be a master is to accept this restriction on your enjoyment that is total, right? And so I think that's why the master is filled with both resentment and envy, in the way that Nietzsche, you're right. I love your point. I never thought of this before. This is a great point, that Nietzsche writes as if the master tells the truth, and he writes from that perspective, right? Like yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
He quotes the Greek masters, right? They describe themselves as complete and without any contradictions and happy, and the slave is the unhappy one, and because of that, the resentful one. But it's completely the opposite, because as you say, and you say so yourself in the end of dissatisfaction, right? That the more you ascend on the social scale, the more you have to repress your own desires.
Yeah. I think that's Freud's point. And I think it's a really good point, that repression is kind of an index of class status, right? Like it's not this like individual ailment. It's like you ascend in class status, you have to repress. And it's true that those people who belong to the slave class, if they identify with that upper class, then they have to repress too. So it's not like there's not an automatic thing. I think there's not like you're in a slave position, you're just free. I don't think that, because I know a lot of people. I mean, in the U.S., it's an interesting story that the working class is the most conservative. The white working class is the most conservative sector of the society. It's a crazy thing, but by far, like it's not even close. So they've so identified with the master class that they themselves have had to undergo that repression as well.
Well, if I might just jump in here, that brings me to the point of freedom. Because watching one of your conferences, I found the concept of freedom through loss quite interesting. Right away it resonated with workers have nothing to lose but their chains, Marx, and so on. But however, when I look at Colombia's reality, many men, regardless of class, but usually, in the most vulnerable classes, have to turn to drug trafficking, and many women have to turn to prostitution. It's just because we're in the periphery and all this stuff. Right. And this phenomenon is now pervasive in popular culture, maybe even globally. And these drug lords are portrayed and presented as, pinnacles of freedom. They can do literally enjoyment. Right. They can do literally whatever they want. Right. And when asked, the individuals themselves or the subjects, women, for example, defend prostitution as a free choice. Sometimes even as a social service. Because the disabled people and lonely men and curious couples and so on and so on. And both men and women present their traits as a form of advancement in life. What you were mentioning, going up the social ladder. And of course, I consider they're honest, when they make this evaluation of their life. However, what's the Hegelian take on that sort of freedom? Because they defend it as even today. Actually, there's an article that a woman wants to abolish prostitution because it's oppressive and so on and so on. Okay. And a prostitute answers back precisely what I've just said. Don't patronize me. You're not my master. I do this out of because I'm free and I enjoy it and so on and so on, and I help people. So what's the Hegelian take on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like because you believe yourself to be free, that doesn't make you free, right? I think that's the
Yeah.
first thing. It's very important, I think. And I also feel like you have to be free for Hegel, you have to feel uprooted from your identity. And I think all those examples of the drug dealer and the prostitute, they don't have that experience of being uprooted. In fact, they feel like they are their identity. And I think freedom depends upon precisely this disjunction that you're always experiencing between, let me put it this way, between who you are and where you are, between, so you never, that not fitting in where you are is crucial to being free. And it seems like the drug dealer, I mean, I only know like stereotypical depictions, right?
That's completely accurate, actually.
Yeah.
The drug dealer feels like it's almost always he, fits in, right? Like fits in the position that they occupy. So I think that's, to me, the index of unfreedom, not of freedom, because the more you feel like you fit in and I'm just doing what comes natural, the more you're unfree.
Yeah, they certainly are totally identified with their social role and their mask and their ego. But so what is it that they should lose to be free?
Well, I think they'd have to lose that feeling of their own good, right? Like that.
Okay.
I think freedom depends on not feeling good about yourself, ironically. I mean, that's like, you can't feel like you have to give up that good feeling about yourself to be free, and this is, I think, a lesson of psychoanalysis too, that you're constantly struggling with yourself and not feeling like you are that feeling like you're not yourself is the sign that you're free. And so I think that's the problem, is that those people in that position, I think, feel like that's who they are. Like anytime, this other thing I would say is anytime you're identified with anytime you eliminate the distance between your subjectivity and your symbolic identity, that's unfreedom. Because symbolic identity is never free, whereas subjectivity is free. And so when you shrink the distance between those two things, that's the way you give up your freedom, because it means you abandon your subjectivity for the sake of your symbolic identity.
In a way, both the prostitute and the drug lord are castrated, so to speak.
Right.
Okay.
Right, but aren't they really disavowing their castration? I mean, that's another way to think of it, right? Like their unfreedom would be disavowing castration, whereas freedom would be the acceptance of your castration.
Okay.
Right. But I think that for them, at least for the drug lord, accepting his or her own castration, well, let's say his, because like you said so yourself, most of them are men. Like accepting his castration is very problematic, more so than for most people, I think, because at least in Colombian culture, the drug lord is the personification of the being that's not castrated.
Right.
The exception, because all of the excesses of the drug lord are precisely the materialization of the non-castration, right? I can do whatever I want. I have the enjoyment of the primordial father, right? You're a drug lord precisely because you want to disavow your castration,
right?
More so than anyone else.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. I'm glad you said primal father, because like the father in Totem and Taboo is exactly what the drug lord seems like, right? Like he can have any women, he can do anything he wants. Absolutely not. The police and governmental authorities have absolutely no sway over him, right? He just does what he wants.
He can buy everybody and everything, and so on and so on. Yeah.
Right. There's nothing that he couldn't have, that he could just buy whatever he wants, right? So I think you're exactly right that he's the personification of this ideal of non-castration.
Which is also Trump is like that as well.
So I'm sorry.
That's Trump's problem as well, because working class Americans, I think, at least from my perspective, think that Trump is the personification of the human that's not castrated, right? He can do whatever he wants, and there are no. I mean, liberals think that they're gonna discredit Trump if they show his excesses, and it's the complete opposite, because people admire him precisely because of his excesses.
Yeah, it's a great point. You should be on the news here in America, I think. We need that point made, because it's really true. Like the CNN is the worst, is the most guilty party of this. Like night after night of the excesses of Trump, and it all it does is feed the people that love him. Because you're exactly right. What they love him for, just like people love drug dealers, they love him for that non-castrated access.
Yeah. Now, on that line, you know, this whole COVID-19, pandemic and so on, has really sort of brought, I believe, this old technocratic master, in conflict with this, Bolsonaro, Trump, former master, completely unbridled. And, to quote Zizek or Stalin, are they both worse?
Yeah, I think that's right. No, I think this is a case where that line is really appropriate, right? Because I hear people in the United States longing for the Obama as a or Hillary Clinton as a technocratic. We need a good technocrat here to solve. I mean, they don't say it like that, but that's what they mean. And I think you're right that the problem is that they don't see how that is precisely what gives rise to the populist figure in Trump. Like it's a perfect circle. Like the one comes along, creates the situation, and then the populist responds, and then that creates a situation that the technocrat responds to, and it's just perpetual. I mean, it's interesting because in the United States we had this chance with Bernie Sanders to get elected, but then that fell apart. So, I mean, there are these moments at which it seems like the only thing that disrupts that is a leftist. Otherwise, you get this perpetual cycle of technocrat and populist right-winger, right?
Yeah, and even here, the dynamic seems to be the same. This perpetual, moderates that are actually just part of the same right, and then the extreme right, and back and forth.
Yeah.
But even I think that, for example, Obama presents himself as a technocrat, but I mean, he at least in his foreign policy, he was like any other U.S. president. I mean, it's not that he didn't hire educated people, unlike Trump, right?
Right.
Who hires basically everyone. I mean, anyone. Sorry.
Right.
But it doesn't matter because the result is exactly the same. I mean, at least in his foreign policy.
Right. In fact, I think it's
even worse.
Well, I was just going to say, I think you could argue from a perspective of all the other countries in the world, Trump's been better than any U.S. president in recent history, right? He's just been better. Like, my friends and I talk, like, if you're from another country and you've had the prospect of Hillary Clinton or Trump, I think you want Trump because for once we've had 4 years, we haven't waged war on anyone. I think if Hillary Clinton had been president, I have no doubt that we'd have gone into Syria, full American presence. So I think
she's a hawk. Yeah,
she's a hawk. Exactly. So that is an irony of Trump's presidency, that even relative to Obama, he's been more of a peacemaker he doesn't care about peace, obviously, but in terms of the world, just because he's so turned back in on himself as a people call him a narcissist. I think that's probably right, although I think that term gets so overused. But I do feel like he's so occupied with himself, and this whole "Make America Great" is a kind of we're going to ignore the rest of the world, and frankly, that's been better for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is sorry, Nicholas?
Yeah, I was just from what you've said, the international relations and so on, the whole aspect of Sweden, speaking about this technocratic master and so on, I've noticed that it's they've been attacked so harshly by the media and experts just for dissenting just a bit, like we'll try something a bit different, and they get this onslaught of attacks. this technocratic master is also, a very harsh master. If
A master,
Yeah.
indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He's not less of a master.
No,
just
no
because
less
he's
of a master.
technocratic.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, Lacan distinguishes between the master's discourse and the university discourse.
Yeah.
But I
exactly.
always think there's something misleading about that, because what you just said, Tomas, like the technocratic is a university kind of figure, but it's just as much a master as the former master was. I think that's true. And what's interesting, I think this is what makes it worse than the old master, is that it's so coupled with the logic of capital, right? Like what the technocrat envisions as efficiency is what functions best within the capitalist economy. So nothing that doesn't fit within the capitalist economy can be technocratically efficient, right? Like that's the way their logic works. And so, like in 2008, Obama had an incredible chance to really socialize a lot of things. Like even I think the right wing here was prepared for nationalization of the banks, et cetera. But he hired a couple of guys who were from Wall Street themselves, and they ended up creating a bailout package that so alienated the working class here that I think that, to my mind, that 2008 or 2009 response to the crisis was Donald Trump's election right there. Like to my mind, that's when the 2016 election was decided. So I feel that's the problem with the technocratic thing, that it just so obeys the logic of capital. That and it's interesting that the populist master are the only ones that feel like they can flout a little bit the logic of capital, right? Like that's what Trump has done a little bit. Like, okay, mostly he's been a capitalist stooge, right? But at times he's kind of like the raising tariffs on China. There's these little gestures that have kind of put a little wrench in the logic of capital that Obama never did.
But that's part of the tragedy, because ultimately to dissent, from this, it seems that you have to be some sort of extreme right-wing nut.
Right.
To dissent. And that's what we're condemned to.
You're right. I think it's well put that's the tragedy, right? That dissent has been channeled into only this right wing. I mean, there are exceptions. I think. I mean, I think around, mostly that's true. Like Orban, Bolsonaro. I mean, around the world, mostly that's true. But I think there are, and I guess he's gone now, but the Morales figure in Bolivia, like that was a case of, I think, dissent that was left wing that even lasted for a while. So that was, I think, I know it was on a pretty small scale, but to my mind, that was one of the most impressive leftist attempts to create an alternative, just because it endured in a way that, and it didn't rely on oil in the way that Chavez did. It didn't have this kind of get out of jail free card that Chavez had. I don't know. So I feel like that was a great example of one way in which there was a opting out that didn't involve just this right wing populist thing that you described, Nicholas.
Yeah, there's a philosopher.
Sorry, Nicholas.
There's a Latin American philosopher that probably Tomas knows much more than me about the guy, Enrique Dussel, and he describes Bolivia as a phenomenon of obedient power. So he says, basically it worked because it was their take, Morales and the social movement behind him, was the power that obeys, obedient power. So yeah, I don't know.
I like that idea.
Yeah, maybe there's something there to add to the history of philosophy or to politics. I don't know. But
right.
There's something strange about the way liberals think about social or political regimes that challenge these
pieties,
that challenge the harmony between capital and the well-being of us, right? Because liberals think that there's a harmony. If you help capital to reproduce itself, it's going to help human beings automatically. There's no conflict at all.
Right.
So of course there's some truth to that. Of course, capital can help human beings, but the fact that there's no complete harmony is something that never passes their minds. But they think that precisely in the regimes that challenge that view, there are a lot of contradictions, right? And they're gonna fall down. For example, Venezuela and Bolivia, they're gonna collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. But strangely enough, they do whatever is in their power to help those supposed contradictions work out themselves, right? So,
right.
But leftists, on the other hand, are pointing out the contradictions of capitalism, but because they actually believe in the contradictions of capitalism, they're always saying, hey, if we don't reform capitalism, it's actually gonna implode. So at least social democrats, right? So like Varoufakis, for example. So we should help capitalism to survive because otherwise it's gonna disintegrate, right? So actually Varoufakis believes, for example, in the actual contradictions of capitalism, but the liberals who project their own contradictions onto Bolivia, for example, don't actually believe that Bolivia is such a contradictory country because they're doing everything that's in their power to undermine it. So, I mean, if it's so contradictory, why should you undermine it? You should just wait for it to fall down.
Right. No, it's a great point. I think, I'm sort of torn about this, your point about Varoufakis, though, right? Because on the one hand, why not just let it play out and destroy itself? Yeah. But on the other hand, I'm pretty convinced by this notion of socialism or barbarism, right? Like it is possible for the decline of capitalism to result in something far worse. I think there is some, I think that's maybe Varoufakis' idea, that by preserving it, we're staving off the worst. So I think that's because I think there's a divide among Marxists, at least the ones that I know, on this very question. Like, is it better? Are we in a more revolutionary situation when things are getting better under capital, or when things are getting worse? And I think that's still an open question, right? Like, I don't think we know, because there have been great revolutionary moments out of seeming prosperity under capitalism, and of course the opposite, like when it's become a disaster, then there have been these revolutionary moments.
Right. All right, Todd, it's been a pleasure talking with you. It's been a real honor. Thank you for everything, and I hope we can keep in touch.
Let's definitely keep in touch with both of you. I had a great time talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right.
And it was great to meet you and to talk to you.
Good to meet you guys. Talk to you soon. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.